All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to History 102, World Civilization since 1500. It's good to be back with you. I'm Dr. Haynes. Haven't seen you for a while. For the last couple of classes, Dr. Ross has talked about the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s and 1800s, and he's really focused on some of the technical aspects of the Industrial Revolution, and particularly last time on its consequences in Asia. Today I'm going to talk more about industrial society and ultimately about socialism. I'm going to frame my words today using a series of major questions, as I often do. So, question number one: what are some of the benefits and some of the problems of industrial society? Question number two: what are some of the similarities and the major differences between the ideologies of liberalism and socialism? And finally, number three: what do the events of 1848 tell us about liberalism's ability to improve society? The Industrial Revolution brought lots of material benefits to the world. Inexpensive manufactured goods, improved standards of living, and growing populations. But the Industrial Revolution also triggered some problematic trends, such as urbanization. Right, millions of people moved from the countryside into cities, and that came with all kinds of new problems. New social classes emerged: the working class, the middle class, the management class. And those classes began to relate to one another in new ways. The relationships were often negative, adversarial, rife with conflict. So, reformers, political thinkers, and workers themselves responded to the same problems in some really different ways. So I want to start with a few minutes on the benefits of industrial society, the benefits of industrial capitalism. And then we'll turn to some of the more problematic aspects of industrial society. The factory system flooded markets with affordable manufactured goods. In 1851, in Great Britain, there was a massive exhibition of the works of all nations, this kind of celebration of capitalist industrial progress. The exhibition consisted of hundreds of machines displayed inside this so-called Crystal Palace, this giant, magnificent exhibition hall built from iron and glass. All right, the signature building materials of the Industrial Revolution. So think of the Crystal Palace and the exhibition itself as kind of symbols of the material benefits of industrial society. The Crystal Palace attracted visitors from around the world. People came to peruse a variety of goods, mostly manufactured in Britain and some from the United States. So visitors could look at manufactured textiles, iron goods, machine tools, sewing machines, even Colt revolvers. The Crystal Palace, the exhibition was a kind of announcement to common people everywhere, perhaps a declaration to people everywhere, that industrialization had improved the standard of living. When goods were mass-produced, costs typically dropped. Clothing especially was now cheaper, more comfortable, more colorful, and easier to clean than ever before. Prices for food fluctuated a lot, but once railroads linked farms to urban markets, prices stabilized and even dropped a bit. So usually, not always, but usually, food was more available and cheaper. So, speaking very generally, workers in industrial cities were at least a little better off than rural farmers, at least in the early 1800s. However, those workers were crammed together in cities more tightly than ever before. And they're crammed into cities along with urban elites. So the huge gap between the haves and the have-nots was more visible, more obvious than ever before. Also, there were just a whole lot more people than ever before. In the 1800s, the European population more than doubled to some 390 million people. Also in the 1800s, the population in North and South America increased sixfold to 145 million. So, why such dramatic population growth over such a relatively short period of time? In the pre-industrial, early modern world, fertility and reproduction rates were consistently fairly high. But disease and child mortality rates were also very high. But over the 1700s and the 1800s, nutrition and healthcare improved. For example, think again about smallpox. Right? We talked a lot about smallpox earlier in the semester, so you know how deadly smallpox can be. Cowpox, however, the strain of the disease that affects cattle, was not as deadly. Milkmaids often contracted cowpox, but they recovered and thereby acquired immunity. In 1796, an English doctor named Edward Jenner observed this phenomenon, and he designed an experiment. Jenner injected cowpox into an 8-year-old boy, and then a few days later, he injected smallpox into the same boy. The boy got sick, but he fully recovered. That's a grossly oversimplified version of how Edward Jenner created vaccination. And he laid the groundwork for the field of immunology. And over time, research in the field led to vaccines that have prevented sickness and death from polio, tetanus, typhoid, whooping cough, measles, and many other maladies. So the upshot here is that in the early 1800s, birth rates remained high, thanks to better nutrition and better access to more advanced health care. More kids survived into adulthood, and the population dramatically increased. So, People are crammed into cities, and there's a whole lot more of them than ever before. So what does life look like in a 19th century industrial city? First, one of the key elements of industrial society was migration itself. In Europe, changes in agricultural practices meant that millions of rural people could no longer make a living by farming. So they moved to cities, or they left Europe entirely and immigrated to the Americas. You don't necessarily need the following numbers in your notes, but I want to give you a sense of the scale of migration. In 1800, only about 20% of the British population lived in cities. 100 years later, in 1900, 75% of the British population lived in cities. In the year 1900, London was the largest city on planet Earth, with a population of 6.5 million people. So, migration is a basic fact of life. More and more people crowding into cities. So what happens when you concentrate millions of people into relatively small spaces? Filth. It gets filthy fast. Trash, human and animal excrement. Industrialization drives urbanization, and urbanization intensifies environmental pollution. Air and water pollution lead to disease. People in industrial cities burn wood and coal to cook their food and heat their homes. Well, that means that they're constantly inhaling smoke. And that encouraged a variety of respiratory diseases. Human, animal, and factory waste all got dumped into the closest river. Cities literally stunk. Indoor plumbing that delivered clean water and removed dirty water was not common until the 1900s. Plus, most transportation in cities still relied on animal power. Horses, mules, oxen. Contaminated water, befouled air, and crowded living conditions lead to the rampant spread of diseases. Cholera, dysentery, tuberculosis. And those rampant diseases killed lots of city dwellers. So urban areas were crowded and filthy. So people who could afford it fled to growing suburbs. But working class people cannot afford it. Working class people remain in city centers, close to factory jobs. But there were no elevators just yet, so buildings in cities can only be so tall. A few floors. So builders make apartments tiny so that they can cram the largest number of people into a building. These tiny, cramped apartments lacked what we would consider basic amenities. So there's no windows, no plumbing, no kitchen, no elbow room, as you can see in the image here. Families often shared a single bed. outside of these crowded tenement buildings, tenants often kept livestock. In 19th century, city dwellers often kept pigs to butcher. Now, eventually, of course, cities outlawed livestock. No livestock in city limits. And that seems logical, given the health and safety issues involved. But pigs were food. So if you couldn't raise pigs for food, you had to work more hours at your factory job to buy more food. So outlawing livestock in cities made city dwellers more dependent than ever on their factory wages. What I'm trying to get at here is that despite the apparent benefits of industrial society, living conditions in industrial cities could be very dire for a lot of people. So, obviously, the Industrial Revolution comes with some important benefits, but also some really dramatic new problems. And those problems contributed to growing animosity between the haves and the have-nots. Ultimately, that animosity manifested itself in political upheaval in Europe and elsewhere, in what are often called the revolutions of 1848. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, most people in most of the world were farmers of one kind or another. But of course, the Industrial Revolution changed all that. It created new social classes that often found themselves in conflict. New captains of industry emerged, along with a new cadre of middle managers. Together, they made up a new social class that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels called the bourgeoisie in the excerpt of the Communist Manifesto that you read for today. A handful of men invested early in industrialization, and they made staggering profits. They used their new money to challenge older military, religious, and aristocratic elites. So these new men, these new captains of industry, provided the capital necessary to industrialize and to militarize. They facilitate things like Britain's victory over China in the Opium Wars that Dr. Ross described last time. A new middle class also emerged. Factory managers, engineers, lawyers, accountants, teachers, doctors, professionals. And as this middle class grew, so did their political clout. And of course, the mass of society belonged to the working class, what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels called the proletariat in the segment of the Communist Manifesto that you read for today. The proletariat. Right, these are the factory workers, the miners, the people who process the raw materials and make them into finished goods. The proletariat often felt exploited by the bourgeoisie, reduced to poverty by unjustly low wages. Yet, the bourgeoisie often subscribed to the ideology of liberalism, to the notion of free markets, They saw poverty as inevitable in a free market society. Capitalists were free to pay the lowest wages the market would bear. So, in the early 19th century, a lot of trends were coming together to produce some pretty intense social and political conflict in Europe and the United States. Industrialization itself, rapid population growth, intensive urbanization, and the obvious the obvious wealth gap between the new social classes. The Industrial Revolution and the ideology of liberalism combined with longer-term trends that stretched back into the 1700s, and Napoleon's disruption of monarchies throughout Europe between 1800 and 1815. The French Revolution's ideals about liberty and equality that stretched all the way back to the Enlightenment. By the mid-1800s, so much disruption had occurred that everyone had to justify their vision of the social order. Some people even call the mid-19th century the age of ideology, because thinkers developed lots of new competing ideologies. In your textbook, you've read about liberalism, socialism, nationalism, and romanticism. And spend the rest of our time today talking just about liberalism and socialism. But you need to know nationalism as well, so make sure that you've read that bit of your textbook. So, those who benefited the most from industrial capitalism tended to use the ideology of liberalism to justify themselves. But lots of people believed that they were not getting their fair share of the benefits of industrial capitalism. So they developed competing ideologies, particularly socialism. Now, modern American conservatives like to call anyone who disagrees with them a socialist. It's uttered as an epithet, an insult. But they rarely, if ever, use that term in appropriate historical context. So for the next few minutes, I want to try to give you some perspective on what it meant to be a socialist in the 1800s. First off, the terms socialism and communism were more or less interchangeable in the 1800s. The term socialism itself came into common usage around 1830. The original promoters of socialism simply wanted to solve the social and economic problems generated by industrial capitalism. The problems I've just described, the overcrowding, the filth, the disease, the huge gap between the haves and the have-nots. Most importantly, socialists wanted greater economic equality. That's the core. Greater economic equality. They want to fix the gross inequality that they see everywhere in every city in Europe. Captains of industry accumulated more and more capital, and with it, political power, while factories had none at all, not even the right to vote. The boom-bust cycle of industrial capitalism was actually increasing the gap between the haves and the have-nots, not shrinking it. So, in the crudest sense, Think of liberalism as focusing on individual liberty, while socialism focuses on equality. But I want to draw your attention to some similarities between these ideologies. Particularly, socialists agreed with core liberal political ideals derived from the Atlantic revolutions and ultimately from the Enlightenment. Liberty, equality, and the consent of the governed. And those are concepts that socialists and liberals agreed on. For early socialists, the problem was that those political ideals had failed to achieve economic liberty. And what good was liberty if you couldn't afford to enjoy it? Socialists believed that greater economic equality would lead to greater liberty for everyone. Now, in the 1830s and the 1840s, the key theorists of socialism responded to the growing inequality they saw around them. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels emerged as the most important voices of socialist ideology. Marx and Engels argued that all of human history boiled down to class conflict over the production and consumption of material goods. Class conflict over the production and consumption of material goods. Throughout all of human history, according to them, people organized into separate classes. One class exploited another economically, and the exploited class inevitably rebelled. Historians call this idea historical materialism, because it boils all of human history down to this idea of class conflict over the production and consumption of material goods. For Marx, industrial capitalism was just the most recent and the most severe form of this class conflict. Marx and Engels also argued that capitalists relied on the state to help them exploit the working class. And this is one of the sort of major divergences from liberalism. Right? They argue that capitalists rely on the state to help them exploit the working class. So governments use the police, the courts, and regressive taxation to keep poor people in line and grant privileges to the wealthy. So according to Marx, there's no such thing as a liberal free market. Instead, the state created policies that benefited industrial capitalists at the expense of workers. Okay, so play that out to the logical conclusion, or at least to Marx and Engels' logical conclusion. If the state, the government, helps capitalists exploit workers, if there's no such thing as a liberal free market, then workers have no choice but to rise up in rebellion, depose existing governments, and establish new governments that will guarantee real freedom, real liberty, genuine equality. A new socialist government would allow everyone to participate equally. A socialist state would end private property ownership and transition to collective property ownership. That way, there would be total political and economic equality. At least, that's what Marx hoped would happen. So, big picture, there are some fundamental similarities between liberalism and socialism, but there's also some meaningful differences. Like liberalism, socialism is really optimistic, almost utopian. In both systems of thought, the long arc of history bends toward perfect human society. Right, so they're both optimistic, they're both hopeful, even utopian, believing that the long arc of human history bends towards a perfect human society. But liberals think liberty and the power of reason will lead to that perfect society. That's all you need. Individual liberty and the power of reason. Socialists, on the other hand, socialists insisted that a perfect society must be founded on equality. And they acknowledge that elites probably will not give up their wealth, their power, and their privilege willingly. So, to create true equality, true liberty, violent revolutions would probably be necessary. So what happens? Are there any revolutions? Sure, of course there are. There were dozens of revolutionary uprisings all over Europe in 1848. So your textbook has this really nice map that shows a point for each of these revolutions of 1848. You'll see there are revolutions in France on that map, in Austria, Russia, Italy, the German states, Spain. So it might look like Marx and Engels were sort of predicting these revolutions, breaking out all over Europe. But remember, they published the Communist Manifesto in February of 1848, roughly the same time that popular uprisings began. So, in a sense, Marx and Engels are just articulating what they're witnessing. Right? They're just describing what was already happening. Across Europe in the 1840s, there were several crop failures that led to what's known as the Hungry 40s. Right, the Irish potato famine is probably the best known of these crop failures. But it's just one part of a larger decade of hardship. Marx and Engels sort of captured the frustration that many were experiencing. They hoped that the Communist Manifesto would unite industrial workers of all nations into a revolution that would overthrow the capitalist system. But most of the uprisings of 1848 were not merely worker rebellions. Instead, the revolutions of 1848 were largely cross-class affairs. Liberal, middle-class doctors, lawyers, university professors, accountants, engineers, they collaborated with more radical workers and students. So they did not necessarily share an identity as workers, as a proletariat. But they did share profound frustration with old guard elites who ignored their needs, their interests. Your textbook explains the complications of the revolutions of 1848, with a particular focus on the creation of the Second French Republic from 1848 to 1852. In short, an economic depression in France, coupled with high unemployment, led to massive street protests in Paris. King Louis-Philippe summoned the National Guard to put down these street protests, but the guardsmen were mostly working-class people. So they joined the rioters. The king abdicated and fled, and the legislature declared France a republic. This so-called Second French Republic began to make a handful of socialist reforms. So, for example, they created state-funded national workshops to employ the unemployed. But conservatives, the middle class, the majority of the middle class, and rural peasants collaborated to put an end to these socialist reforms. Workers in Paris launched a new round of street protests, riots. And this time, they suffered bloody repression. Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, Louis Napoleon, was democratically elected president. But soon he made himself emperor. Elites all over Europe responded similarly to the revolutions of 1848. And the trend is quick, ruthless crackdowns on revolutionaries. For a lot of people, these crackdowns just proved that Marx and Engels had been right all along. The state really was collaborating with elite industrial capitalists at the expense of the working class. All of human history really was the story of class conflict, one class exploiting another until the exploited class rebelled. By the early 20th century, things began to improve in Europe and the United States, mostly because the middle class got big enough and wealthy enough to demand the right to vote. They slowly pushed through progressive reforms democratically. But they're still focused on that socialist goal of equality, right? Economic equality, a more equal society. So in Europe, these middle-class progressive reformers who are getting reforms enacted democratically, but adhering to old-fashioned socialist ideas like equality, in Europe they become known as democratic socialists. So, to wrap up, big picture, industrialization promised incredible benefits. Wealth for all, cheap goods, miraculous machines. New ideologies with deep historical roots promised a better society founded on liberty and equality. But the transition to an industrial society proved traumatic. Industrialization fostered dislocation, destitution, and violence, both in Europe and abroad. Next time, we're going to have a special guest lecture who will pick up the story there with a new form of industrialized exploitative violence, particularly in Africa. So we'll pick up the story there next time.